Hello, this is Dr. David Bracken of Kaiser University, introducing to you today a new performance model that I have put together, which I call ALAMO. Welcome. In order to talk about the ALAMO model, let's go way back and introduce ourselves to Kurt Lewin, who is called the founder of social psychology. Dr. Lewin proposed a model of human behavior that states that behavior is a function of the person and his or her environment. To quote Dr. Lewin, to understand or to predict behavior, the person and his environment have to be considered as one constellation of interdependent factors. And here is the citation for that statement. Dr. Lewin's contribution to the field of psychology was significant, and we also saw happening around that point in time the Hawthorne experiments as well, where we also learned that the context of human behavior and the social context in particular are very important determinants of what we see in terms of performance. Let me just say at this point in time that this presentation here today does have a focus largely on applications in organizational settings, but I also would propose to you that you look at it through the lens of the ALAMO model that could be applied as you learn it here today to almost all aspects of our day-to-day life. So the roots of the ALAMO model come from a performance equation that is so intuitive and so old that we really can't say specifically when it first came into being, but ability times motivation certainly has a lot of intuitive appeal. And notice that it is also a multiplicative model in that we must have both elements of the equation in order for performance to occur at all. Either factor can't, if it goes to zero, then performance goes to zero. In terms of how I define these factors, we'll kind of rely, starting off here, in terms of kind of traditional thoughts about skills, capabilities, knowledge, and information for ability on that side of the equation. And motivation, we'll see, of course, is a very complex determinant of behavior, and we'll spend a little time thinking about that, but it is such a broad and open-ended factor in terms of human performance that we won't be able to dwell on it in any great length. So the question becomes then, when we have ability and motivation, in terms of trying to understand human behavior, and this process that I'm describing to you here today is largely one about understanding, or to phrase it another way, doing diagnoses of why we are having some suboptimal level of performance. In other words, things are not quite where we want them to be, and we want them to be at some higher level. And so the question becomes, how do we do that? In terms of our diagnoses of why those things occur, are we addressing the right things? So the question is, do we have the right ingredients in terms of the weighting and the proportions of the elements that go into play? And are we using them for the right purpose? I came across this quote from Karen May, who at the time in 2012 was being interviewed by the New York Times, and she was vice president of people development at Google. I believe she's still at Google at some higher level, but Dr. May is an industrial organizational psychologist. In the course of that interview, she said these things. Don't use training to fix performance problems. If you got a performance problem, there is a process to go through to figure out what's causing it, the diagnosis. Maybe the person doesn't have the knowledge or skill or capability, what we're calling ability here. Or is it motivation? Or something about relationships within the work environment? Or even lack of clarity about expectations. She goes on to say that training is the right solution only if the person doesn't have the capability. But what I have seen in other places is sort of a knee-jerk reaction by managers to put someone in a training class if somebody isn't performing well. So Dr. May is speaking there of our tendency to jump to conclusions when we think we know what is going on in terms of suboptimal performance and what needs to be fixed. And she says our predisposition is to assume that it's ability, knowledge or skill or capabilities, when it may be some other things. And or do we put people into training because other things are more difficult to diagnose and to understand and to fix? That train of thought is also found in this book by Jerome Grootman that I would recommend to you, called How Doctors Think. Dr. Grootman was a victim of misdiagnosis and had some severe consequences as a result of that, and became curious as to why misdiagnoses occur and result in bad treatment or sometimes even death to the patients. So he went about interviewing a large number of his peers and other physicians to collect critical incidents, in other words, times when they had also, and admittedly so, done misdiagnosis that had resulted in some bad outcome. And it's something that, again, I suggest that all of you pick up and read, and you can learn something about it as to how to perhaps prevent misdiagnosis from happening, or at least reduce its probability. But the moral of the story I got out of it was this thought that sometimes the key to success is uncertainty. In other words, not jumping to conclusions too quickly as to what you think the problem is and what you should fix and do about it. And he offers up in the appendix even a list of questions that you as the patient should be asking your physician before a prescription or a treatment is actually applied, and to ask your physician things like, well, what else could it be? And we are asking that question here. What else could it be in addition to ability and motivation? It took me not too long working with this and in my work to come up with the thought there is a set of constraints put on performance that we shall call opportunity. Also a multiplicative factor, and includes things like, especially in work settings, like empowerment. Are you given the opportunity even by the organization or your manager, the authority to do something, whether it's psychological or actually specific? Are there policies that are in place, or rules or laws that keep you from doing things? Do you have the resources you need in order to perform, such as the classic case of the widget maker who's an expert at making widgets, but when his or her widget machine is not functioning, their performance goes to zero. They can't do anything about that. And we'll talk even a little bit about social norms, which can be perceived and be real or only perceived factors that might prevent you from performing at your optimal level, if at all. This is such an old notion around adding opportunity to this equation that it goes back. I found something here as early as 1982, where these authors talk about the missing opportunity in organizational research, and have added that into our consideration. But it really has not been that specifically and directly applied to our understanding of human performance, in my opinion. So I believe, though, that there is one other factor. If we talk about, again, this multiplicative equation of ability, motivation, and opportunity, we can generate a lot of behavior if those things are optimized and we have people performing who have excellent ability, are highly motivated, and have the full opportunity to exhibit it. But that doesn't mean necessarily that the organization or the team or the family is benefiting from that if it's not all applied to things that are important to the organization's success. And so, in addition to adding in these various things, and we're going to talk about some other factors here that I've got in red that I'd also like us to consider in our modern day definitions of these terms, there is one other factor that I would like to add in, and that's called alignment. In other words, are we moving forward in applying high levels of ability, motivation, and opportunity, but in such a way that we are doing the correct thing for the organization? And those things can be created through things like vision statements as to what it is that the organization is trying to achieve, what strategies are you using, what values are important in terms of how people behave, and that could also include your personal values as well as external values, and then of course simple goals and objectives. So let's talk about this. It's a mathematical model in a very simplistic form, but nonetheless is very powerful by being multiplicative. And just conceptually, to think about how these variables work, let's think about it in terms like percentages or scores that go from 0 to 100, where the 100 is where you max out. And of course, like I said, when it goes to 0, then the equation goes to 0. So ability can go from 0 to 100. We can't have negative ability. Likewise, with motivation, goes from 0 to 100. If we have motivation that is detrimental to the organization to do destructive things, I'm putting that in the category of being misaligned motivation and behavior, not the lack thereof. And finally, opportunity, which also goes from 0 to 100. But of all these four factors, alignment is perhaps, and I propose to you, the most powerful, in that it can actually draw resources away from the organization if it is dedicated towards accomplishing the wrong thing that is not important to the organization. And therefore, alignment can go from minus 100, which is 180 degrees contrary to what the organization desires to be done, to plus 100, where we have, of course, perfect alignment, that we're doing exactly what it is that the organization, which I said also like in teams, functions, and families, which are organizations, might also apply to that as well. So why Alamo? Part of it is to just get us to step back and realize that performance has many determinants. And before we jump to these conclusions that Karen May was talking about, we need to sit back and try to understand what the possibilities may be before we put together a diagnosis and a prescription as to how to fix them. And mnemonics and acronyms are easy ways to systematically go through those things. And we're applying a little bit of psychology here and some common sense and with a little bit of math thrown in. For example, here I just throw up this mnemonic here, Vindicate, that is used as a differential diagnostic procedure in the medical profession as when somebody kind of walks in the door and something's wrong with them and you're trying to figure out as a physician what the cause possibly could be. Here is a list using the mnemonic for them to think through what those things are in a very orderly and systematic way without hopefully missing something that might be important in terms of their considerations before they do a diagnosis and a treatment. So let's kind of walk through the ALAMO model. We've got, first talk about ability. And I said I was going to offer up to you some of the contemporary thinking about ability that goes just beyond skills and knowledge. And one of the interesting thoughts here that's offered up by Doug Conant, who was in the past president of Nabisco, Campbell Soups, chair of Avon, and who therefore has a lot of experience about what it takes to be a successful leader in organizations. And he offers up in this interview that he thinks that leaders have three traits. They have to be a person of great character, and they have to do what they say they're going to do. It's a combination of character and competence. If the organization doesn't trust you, you are toast. And toast, I think, means that the equation goes to zero. And part of what's interesting about this is that ability and competence and trust can be things that are bestowed upon you by others. The question here, for example, is, are you trusted? And are you seen as competent? Which are, perceptions that people might have that is also helpful for you to be aware of if you are not then in their eyes performing at the optimal level. As I said, motivation is a very complex thing. I mean, just to give you a sense of just a couple theories of motivation that we talk about, there's Maslow's motivational theory. Abraham Maslow, who offered up this theory of motivation in terms of this pyramid that you may be familiar with, hopefully, in terms of the 5 levels. And it is an easy way for us to think about motivation and performance that has withstood the test of time, and we still find it in current textbooks. But of each of these 5 layers, of course, can be dissected in and of itself and be very complex. Another way of looking at motivation is expectancy theory by Victor Vroom, who proposed an interestingly enough mathematical equation where motivation is a combination of expectancy times instrumentality and times valence, and for valence of the specific outcome that the person wishes to achieve, its value to them. So we don't have time here today to talk about all these and define them for you, and hopefully pique your interest enough to go and do a little reading on this on yourself as to if you think expectancy theory looks interesting. I did my whole master's thesis on expectancy theory and various ways of combining these variables and mathematical combinations to see which worked best a long time ago. And here's the citation for Victor Vroom in 1964. And then opportunity. Napoleon Bonaparte is famous for saying, ability is of little account without opportunity. And while Napoleon ultimately was perhaps not the most successful person, nonetheless, for a period of time, he was extremely successful, but came to this realization that we have to sometimes account for and create opportunities for ourselves. Let's talk about opportunity in terms of, I think, being such an important factor that it has not been addressed in all its glory. This picture that actually I took off a television screen was a commercial for a financial services organization that was making the point that when you come and work with them, their employees are not constrained by policies and practices, and that they will work with you to help you, give you the best service and solve whatever problem or whatever goal it is that you wish to achieve. Do it very nicely here in a graphic way with chains. Another version of it is, of course, our Dilbert cartoons, where Dilbert goes to the bathroom cabinet, medicine cabinet, reads on the medicine bottle, "Do not use if the seal is broken." And because he misunderstands the intent of that message, he says, "Great, how are you supposed to get the pills out if you don't break the seal?" So there he is not given the opportunity because of his misperception of what the message is that he's getting about how to use this particular tool. Another version of it is your coworkers. And here we have Thomas Edison showing off his new invention of the light bulb to a friend or a coworker or a peer, to which the response is, "Well, it's wonderful, Tom, but have you given any thought to how many people it will take to change this thing? And hopefully you are maybe aware of the whole raft of light bulb jokes that are out there, and here's just one version of it, and I offer it up as what we often encounter when we offer up new ideas to help solve a problem, and that our environment is a doubting one, or people's first reaction is to talk about problems before they talk about solutions. That comes in another way in terms of this example here of the latest innovation of a goose that lays eggs of solid gold. Whereas the other people in the organization have a number of interesting, constraining comments, such as, that's a distraction from our core. In other words, what the organization is currently doing and what they think is responsible for their success. And the woman in the middle says, we have no budget, so we don't have resources for goose-related expenses. And the last person says, on that note, we'll need the feathers and liver for another project. So not only are we not going to use the golden eggs, we're going to destroy the source of it. Opportunity sometimes interacts with personality to determine what happens when we encounter a barrier or suboptimal performance. Here's a person, stick figure, who pulls a lever, gets zapped as a result of it, stands and thinks about it a little bit as to what to do next, where we say, well, the normal person would say, well, I guess I shouldn't do that. But the scientist says, I wonder if that happens every time. And the scientist, therefore, out of curiosity and to help answer that question, is about to pull the lever again. Some of the self-limiters are inner opportunity killers. Just to create your awareness about this, think about when somebody asks you to do something in whatever environment. Do you sometimes think these things like, I won't be successful, therefore I better not do it. My coworkers will dislike me if I do this thing for whatever reason. That might be precedent, or their jealousy, or it makes them look bad, or it may be saying why my coworkers, my contribution won't be noticed or rewarded. Or finally, I can do it another time. The procrastination excuse. In my coaching practice, when people say these sort of things, and then we talk about, well, let's talk about what needs to be done. What is important to you? What are your goals? And to get the person then to move ahead and not have these inner opportunity killers. And when they say what they want to do, then moving ahead, asking them, well, why haven't you done that already? And that will then come up with some other inner opportunity killers that need to be talked about and diagnosed and solved. This cartoonist will read things and then turn them into visuals, and his where you can find him if you're interested in this is down at the bottom right hand part of this. And the saying is, those who, by Rosa Luxemburg, say, those who do not move do not notice their chains. In other words, metal chains are very obvious and physical and tangible, and we see them. But mental chains, things that are holding us back because they are in our heads and we may or may not be aware of them, are the most difficult to notice and to break. Finally, let's talk about alignment. And as I said earlier, alignment is perhaps the most powerful part of this component. Like all of them, it can not only drive things to zero, but it can drive things in a negative direction. So we're actually drawing resources from the organization. Let me use a little sports example around this. and introduce you to Jim Marshall, who was a member of the Minnesota Vikings back in the 60s and 70s. So you may not well know this story, and if you don't know much about American football, we'll try to take that into consideration. Jim Marshall was what's called a defensive lineman, which means he plays in a very high contact, powerful position on every defensive play, typically. And it's very unusual for defensive linemen to have long careers without injuries, for example. But Jim Marshall was one of the best at his profession. He was on champion teams, so he was on conference champion teams. He was an all-star. They call it the Pro Bowl for a couple of years, selected to that. His number was retired and put in the Vikings Ring of Honor. He was the captain of the Minnesota Vikings for 15 years. He was on their 25th anniversary team as being amongst the best Vikings for a period of both 25 years and 40 years. Has been named as one of the 50 greatest Vikings of all time, and had a record, I think it's still, as it says here, the record for defensive ends in playing in 276 consecutive games without missing one for injury or sickness. And for a period of time had the NFL, the whole league record, and which was broken by like a punter or somebody who doesn't play every play and has very low contact. But Jim Marshall, back in that period of time, was, a lot of people knew him as a great player, but he was known to even people who weren't big football fans for one particular thing that happened on one particular day. And that here says he has an opponent's fumbles recovered career. Well, one day he picked up a fumble, and this picture shows him picking up the ball and carrying it and running in the 180-degree wrong direction. And I heard somebody say once, there's nothing worse than a big, fast football player running in the wrong direction. Jim Marshall picked up the ball and ran all the way to the end zone for the other team. Didn't score 6, that doesn't count for 6 points against the team, but it is called a safety and counts for 2 points against your team. And he threw the ball up in the air, so there was no time to fix that problem, and he didn't actually know he had done it until his teammates, well actually his opponents, came up and shook his hand and thanked him for scoring some points in their favor. So Jim Marshall has the NFL record, National Football League record, for the shortest play in league history at minus 66 yards, which was one of the most embarrassing moments in professional sports history, according to Sports Illustrated. That is total misalignment for a person operating at the highest levels of ability, motivation, and an opportunity that was created when the ball was fumbled by the other team and he was there to pick it up. So how do we create alignment? We should be very clear as to what the strategy and goals are. We should have clear values, like in organizational settings or even in your family setting, saying what is it that is important to us in terms of the way that we behave. For example, when I had children, one of the values of us was to convene at a family every day when I wasn't traveling. So the behavior that I exhibited was to be home for dinner every night when I was at home. And that's how you show that you are walking the talk and living the values of the organization in that one example there. And then hold people accountable for acting in ways that are not aligned with the values or the goals of the organization. And we can create alignment by checking in with people, giving them frequent feedback, and telling them and reminding them what the goals are. And on a regular basis, maybe daily, give people reinforcement for things they're doing consistently with organizational goals, and then those that are not as consistent. I want to close out this presentation just to show you two examples of how these can be applied, how the ALAMO model can be applied for diagnosing and talking to individuals, teams, and organizations. And I propose to you that the family is a type of organization, and many of you probably belong to other types of organizations, whether they're clubs or societies or that sort of thing. And in each of these boxes, saying how would alignment, ability, motivation, and opportunity manifest themselves. So if you are, for example, having suboptimal performance at a team level, to spend some time thinking and talking about what are some of the alignment factors that might be coming into play. Like, does the team know its charter? Do they have their roles? Do they have clear team leadership? Or in terms of its ability, has the team have the right people in it, and are they getting the information that they want? Or in terms of motivation, do they have the right incentives and perhaps even peer relationships as they motivate each other? And on opportunity, do they have the right resources? Do they have even time away from their real job, so to speak, to meet and do what needs to be done, and just give them the time, sufficient time to meet as a group? So all of those things could be causing suboptimal team performance, and our job as scientists and practitioners is to systematically go through those possible things. And I'm proposing to you that ALAMO, as an acronym, could be a language that is created inside the organization. And when you're talking with team members or other leaders in the organization saying, well, if this team is not functioning, let's go walk through the ALAMO model and talk about individually alignment, ability, motivation, and opportunity as how they might be the causes before we go off and try to solve the problem that might be without knowing really what's causing it. And finally, to bring this thing to life, I do a lot of employee surveys where we at the organizational level, ask questions of employees to give feedback to upper level management. But in the process of doing that and asking these questions of employees, we are also creating alignment in that we are communicating to them what the organization thinks is important enough to ask their opinion of, and an implicit commitment that the organization is willing to change these things if enough people in the organization say that it is not where it needs to be. And so progressive organizations will not only ask questions around these various factors, but make a commitment to follow through and do follow through with action plans. And one way to organize the categories in the survey is around the ALAMO factors. And if you're trying to create a language in the organization around using ALAMO, and you say, what does it mean to have alignment? Well, it means you have a clear picture of the direction the company's headed. It means that management's giving you a clear picture of the direction. You see a clear connection between your work and company success, and so forth. And then around ability, do you have the information you need? Do people have the skills that they need and the training that they need? Around motivation, do you feel that the work is important? Do you get recognized? Are you held accountable? Do people have an equal opportunity to succeed, and so forth? And finally, opportunity, asking, well, are people here empowered? Are approvals required that get in the way of doing it? Do I feel that my ideas are understood and considered, and even occasionally accepted and implemented? So perhaps you can see as about how we bring ALAMO to life and each of these four factors to life by describing what it means when an organization is successfully meeting the expectations around those four factors. So I'm going to wrap this up here, and thank you for being in the audience here around ALAMO, and I hope you find some ways to apply it in your life, in your work, in your relationships, and maybe, at a personal level, when things aren't going quite the way that you personally want things to go, to step back and reflect a little bit about what's going on in your own mind that might be keeping you from fully performing at the level that you want and the expectations of the people that you work with. Thanks very much.